My name is Dr. Rashida L. Weaver, and this is the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Practice and Mindset class. Today we have an e-talk with the founder of Mobilizer, and which is a volunteer recruitment and events platform used by Democratic campaigns, progressive organizations, unions, 501c3 nonprofits, governments, and private companies. So please welcome to our class, Alan Kramer. Give us a talk about your entrepreneurial journey.
Hello, everyone. Where should I start?
Well, you can start by giving us an overview of what Mobilize is and the history of it, and then we'll do our Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. So Mobilize is a company, as you summarized, that is basically the main volunteer platform used by progressive campaigns, labor unions, and increasingly nonprofits. And we really have built it as a sort of tool set that combines sort of things about, Eventbrite and Meetup together in a single platform. So we sort of give you as an organization this tool set to have the main place to drive your supporters to take action, to be able to discover all of the different ways that you can support a cause in this sort of branded environment, while also building a network around it. So we've now had something like 3,000 organizations use the platform and 4.4 million volunteers across the country over the last 3.5, 4 years. And really are building out this consumer brand at the same time. So to give you a sense, every event that is created on Mobilize into your branded instance is also posted on our sort of national feed that has every event that's on Mobilize across every organization. And so that's becoming sort of this consumer destination. That's kind of a very brief, poor summary of what it is. But I think the history in some ways is even more illustrative. We started Mobilize in the wake of the 2016 election, really trying to sort of think about ways that we could support causes and progressive organizing. We came from a pretty unabashedly political background. We have since expanded on to much more nonpartisan work as we bring on food banks and nonpartisan nonprofits and things like that onto our tool set. But we really started as this sort of progressive platform. And actually started first and foremost as a nonprofit. We were building tools for ourselves. And so, thinking about sort of the entrepreneurial journey, one of the interesting things for us was building tools for ourselves. And we were sort of our own first customer for the course of like the first year, actually, or 6-7 months. And then what we realized was the technology that we were building, this sort of events platform, was the thing that was most differentiated about what we were doing. And a couple of potential investors, people that we've been talking about sort of funding the nonprofit, said, hey, we're not going to fund the nonprofit, but if you spin this out as a company, we actually think that this is a really good idea and we'd seed you. And so we decided that was, for a bunch of reasons, a really interesting path for us. So we spun up the platform. We actually sort of wound down the nonprofit side of the organization. And really focused on the technology. And I'm sure we'll go into a little bit more like how we validated the idea and things like that. And I'm more than happy to talk about that sort of initial validation phase. But at that point, we'd had a little bit of validation, not a lot, but a little bit of sort of indication that people were going to use this product, this sort of branded platform to allow you to post all of your events in a single place. There was sort of some automation baked in, so we had reminders and stuff like that. And then as soon as we sort of spun up the technology company, we raised a very small seed round, or sort of pretty small seed round. And we started growing our engineering team and really scaled up over the course of 2018. So that was 2017 that we did sort of that pilot phase as a nonprofit. We spun up the company and started doing sales in the first couple of months of 2018. And then over the course of 2018, we grew quite a lot. We grew to be pretty well known in this sort of narrow political space. We were used by something like a few hundred political campaigns, dozens of big sort of national organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, other big groups that were doing a lot of mobilization across the country, and sort of very quickly became the default sort of platform for a lot of organizing work in our space. And so then in 2019, we really capitalized on that. We ended up working with 20 of the Democratic presidential primary campaigns before eventually powering the Biden campaign's volunteer program. And so that was sort of the political part of our work that kept growing. But at the same time, we used that traction to start to expand into other verticals. So you mentioned, the fact that we've grown a lot in labor unions. So we now work with the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, SEIU, for them to be able to use our platform for mobilizing their members to take action. And so we use that sort of time and that growth to allow us to continually build out a better platform to put that in the hands of new types of organizations. And that's sort of similarly what we've been doing with nonprofits. We, over the course of 2019, we raised a little bit more before closing our Series A round at the end of 2019, which really helped us grow much faster. We raised relatively small Series A in the grand scheme of big tech financing and things like that, but certainly gave us enough to propel our growth. We raised about 3.75 million in our Series A. So small as Series A goes, but definitely not insubstantial, and gave us a lot of runway. And use 2020 to continue to accelerate our development. We grew the team from about 20 to 40 as we were sort of powering the presidential campaign, continuing to bring on labor unions, nonprofits, advocacy organizations, and things like that, and really refined product a lot. We grew our product team pretty substantially to about 17, 18, and then grew sales and marketing substantially at the same time. And over the course of that period, had gotten some interest from much larger technology players in our space, sort of in the broader nonprofit technology world, that had approached us and asked us, if we would be interested in joining forces. And so we explored some of those options, and then talked to a bunch of people, got a sense of what offers might look like, whether or not that'd be interesting. At the time, we had a bunch of cash on hand. We had just raised our Series A, so we were in no rush to sell or be acquired, but actually gave us a bunch of the right sort of, gave us the ingredients to have the right set of conversations, right? We weren't in any rush. We could sort of be very measured and thoughtful about whether or not it was going to be the right fit. And then shortly after the election, in 2020, we announced that we had been acquired by a company called Every Action, that's Insight Partners backed. Insight Partners is a big private equity, growth equity fund. And Every Action is sort of the preeminent nonprofit technology player. They're growing very quickly, taking on Blackbaud and Salesforce in sort of that space to serve nonprofits with the best technology stack. We've always had a deep integration with them, and so are now 4 months into being post-acquisition, and really sort of integrating those two companies. So I've sort of seen a lot of the full arc of the journey from initial idea to raising capital to building the team to scaling sales to now having gone through an acquisition, and trying to integrate those two companies. So that's a very quick, probably more long-winded than you bargained for, but quick sort of overview of the arc of Mobilize. Wow. And we got a lot of growth ahead of us. So this is really just the start in a lot of ways, but that's kind of been from an entrepreneurial process perspective, that's been sort of what it's looked like.
I have a lot of questions within that, but how did you literally build the first platform? And did you raise money or bootstrap to get the working prototype?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we first started building, we actually used some existing off-the-shelf technology. We licensed some technology basically to go have something to validate in the market. Realized that there was a lot to be said for the approach, but we needed something much more custom, sort of for our own use case and what we saw as the key challenges. So we ended up building our own platform sort of on top of and alongside some of the technology that we'd licensed. And licensing that technology, was helpful to get some feedback, but we realized that it also showed us where there was real need for us to build something very unique. So we brought on our first engineer as a contractor, who actually later became our CTO, and started building some very lightweight products. Basically, the very early platform was an events feed. It had sort of, your URL was your destination with your brand, and listed all of the events in your organization in a single place. It was a really not a good looking platform. It was very hacked together. Our CTO probably built it in a few weeks. We eventually brought on a contractor to update some stuff. And to answer your question about whether or not we bootstrapped it, we didn't. We raised a small amount into the nonprofit at that point. So we'd raised, I think, $200,000 into that entity to start to build some of the technology, to build out sort of the organizing team that was really doing like nonprofit programming, sort of progressive organizing on that side. But we were, again, building sort of those tools for ourselves. And so we were doing a little bit of both.
So I'm curious because a lot of the students, for example, they want to become entrepreneurs, and how did you raise it? Because it sounds easy when you say, oh, I raise X amount of dollars.
Yeah.
But like literally how?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my co-founder at the time, who has since, he actually just joined the Biden administration recently. But he led a lot of the fundraising efforts, and some of this is a combination of he happened to know a lot of venture capitalists, and so that was certainly helpful in the sort of very early days. So we raised first very much sort of an inside, what we could sort of friends and family round, but then increasingly we're able to raise more from kind of funds that were looking at this space. And I think that we did have a unique advantage, which was that at the time we were building into this sort of nonprofit technology, political advocacy technology space where there was an increasing amount of attention after the 2016 election. And so there were a bunch of people around this space that were looking to make investments in it. And so if I sort of think about the like general lesson, as you're looking at a certain space to start a company, and I would try and figure out who has already been investing in that space, and figure out, is there some trend that you're building on where there are people that are looking into it, people that are interested in it, figure out what funds or individuals may be investing in it, and may have sort of some amount of insight or an interest in placing other bets in it.
Awesome. I'm just taking notes.
Yeah.
And how did you market, mobilize, and gain awareness to users?
So one of the other weird things about starting a business in this sort of political space is that in a lot of ways it's very small. There are, and this is one of the advantages of doing sort of a very verticalized approach, right? If you go and target a very narrow segment of the market, you can build a reputation much quicker versus trying to do something sort of for the mass market or for, every company under the sun, I'm going to sell you a service. No, versus like, hey, I'm going to build a reputation in this narrow slice where there are 5,000 potential buyers and I can meet, 500 of them at a conference, or I can, build a reputation that way. And so I would say a lot of it at the very beginning was, a mixture of finding those partnerships that would be splashy. So we did a big partnership with the Democratic National Committee in sort of 2017, supporting them on a program that gave us some amount of reputation. And again, this is sort of very specific to the political use case in some ways, but also I think has a lot of lessons for what's that first big partnership that can get you a lot of credibility by, bringing them into your, validating your approach. But then the other thing was like, I spent 3 or 4 months on the phone myself, like calling state legislative candidates that might want to use our product and like in coming up with pricing on the fly. So like, there was a lot of also just like hard work of, calling people, asking them for feedback, figuring out if they wanted to use the product, and then, making up pricing as you go. And so I always tell this story that it was, in the very beginning, we downloaded a list of like, here are all the potential people that I can call. And it was like a list of, 1,000 people. And we sent some emails and whatever. And we started calling through it. And there was this guy that answered the phone that was running the campaign of the congressional campaign of his wife in Texas. Her name's Julie Oliver. Matt Oliver was his name. I remember him very well. This was like February of 2018. And he said, oh, no, Alan, we can't pay $500 a month. No way. Too expensive for the product. And I was like, Matt, how much could you pay? It's like $250 a month. And I was like, okay, I'll get back to you. So I called him up three hours later, and I was like, Matt, you're in luck. We just launched the basic tier, and it costs $250 a month. And so then we signed them up, and they've actually been a client multiple times since then as they've run multiple congressional campaigns. So it very much is like that iterative process of just calling people, understanding, what it is that they're looking for, what problems you can solve, and using that to also refine the pitch, right? Like it's much easier in some ways to refine it one-on-one, where you can ask a bunch of questions about what they're using, how they think about what their problems are, what you might be able to deliver on top of that. And then sort of very quickly drive those iterative cycles where you're refining, your pitch and your offering as well. And then obviously pricing.
Yeah, wow. I love that story. That's an amazing example. And also just of how do you even deal with rejection or just the fear of rejection? Because there's two things, right? The fear of rejection and then actually getting rejection, but then, deciding to how to move forward from that. Do you keep on going forward or do you just stop? Because many people stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way I think about this. Well, it's a good question. I don't know. It's sort of interesting, right? It's really hard to run a company for a long time and not have wins. You have to find some type of win somewhere to keep yourself going at certain points. But what that win may look like may not be, I'm going to get 100% of people to say yes, but that win may be if I make 100 calls to different prospective clients in those very early days, maybe 2 of them say yes. And those 2 people are your wins that are going to be your early customers and early validators and, help propel you forward. So I think it's really sort of defining success in the right way in some ways. But it's definitely hard when you're like running and trying to build and things aren't going well. And, because there are definitely those times too, right? Where you go for way too long without a big win. And you just got to keep pushing and then use that next big win to propel you to the next big thing, because you sort of, teams need that energetic boost. I need that energetic boost as sort of a founder to have those wins. But sometimes it takes a couple of months to have a big win, and you go through periods of time where you do feel like you're slogging. I think it's always ideal for every person, like ideally extend that duration of like how long you need to go without a win, without it getting you sort of detached from what success needs to look like for your company. What I mean by that is like, you also don't want to pretend like things are going to magically turn around at some point just because like it's been a while, but you do need to push through for some period of time. And like that, how long you should be pushing on any given path really does depend on the business and the problem that you're trying to solve. So like if you're going into, start to sell a product on the market and like you're calling a bunch of people, you're talking to a bunch of people and like no one's saying yes.
Yeah.
You don't want to like blindly hope that one day it's magically going to turn around. You want to be making sure that you're figuring out like, okay, is it the value proposition is not strong enough because like actually they don't have a big problem, or they have this problem but they're not willing to spend money on it, or whatever else that may be. And so maybe you redefine what a win looks like and say, hey, actually if I can just get 5 pieces of good data or feedback this week, then maybe that's sufficient. And it's really like figuring out how you define those wins to propel you to that next stage. So that's a long way of saying like rejection in and of itself is not that hard if you produce yourself enough bats, right? Like if you try enough times and you set your expectations that like, hey, maybe I'm only going to win in 5% of these cases, but that may be fine for right now. And it's just about finding who those people are. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of how I thought about it, at least.
Oh, it does. And especially your comment about data. Sometimes it just is the data. It's that people are interested in you, but maybe they're just not purchasing, and you just have to figure out why, like what you, and that's so important, so important. Also, next question. So was there any particular event or situation that led to significant scaling, or was it a gradual build?
There were a bunch of different moments. I would say raising our seed round, which happened sort of over a period of like 6 months, actually, the way we raised our seed round. We'd raised sort of the like very early capital, sort of pre-seed, like, to build that initial prototype and stuff like that. But when we raised our seed round at the end of 2017, early 2018, that was definitely one of the first big things, was like, okay, we both had validation in this ecosystem, but we also had enough money to last us for, I forget at the time, maybe a year or 18 months or something like that. So that was one big milestone. I think the second big thing was we got these 2 really big clients in March of 2018 that really propelled our growth very quickly. And it based in this, in our market, what we needed to do, and with our product, we needed to build a network very quickly. So we needed to be able to bring on some key players that could attract other people to join our network and sort of use our platform. And so we got these sort of 2 early and big customers, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and an organization called Swing Left, to leverage our platform and sort of really make Mobilize the place that everyone had to be to participate in this network and collaborate with each other. And so that was a huge moment for us and really was one of the big pivotal points for us to grow in 2018. The other was another really big mega contract with the DNC in 2018 that put us in like a lot more campaigns. Basically, they said, hey, we want to go buy this on behalf of, a bunch of players. The dynamics in this market are obviously sort of unique in some ways, but in a bunch of markets, you will have these like key customers that if you can get, they can become validators for other potential clients. And so figuring out both who can play the role of that validator is really important. The other big moment, I would say, we won a couple of these, like a lot of it are these sort of key sales milestones and fundraising milestones. So we also locked up a couple of presidential campaigns early in 2019 that we beat out a couple of competitors to win the deals for, and really allowed us to solidify ourselves as the go-to solution for this thing. And so I would say, like, finding those, like, who are those marquee customers that you have to win, and then doing anything that you can to win them. Like, there was this one, we launched there was a presidential campaign that we wanted to bring on the platform, and we've been talking to them for like a month and a half. And we found out that they were considering another vendor for the same use case, and because they weren't sure if they were a little bit ahead in building this piece of functionality. So basically, we pulled our engineering team off, which at that point was like 5 or 6 people, pulled them entirely off of everything else they were working, had them basically build a prototype in like less than a week and shipped it to them. And we ended up winning the deal because of that, because we made the decision to like fully shift and like say, hey, it's worth deprioritizing anything else except for winning this customer and bringing them on. And then they had brought such a reputational sort of halo that it sort of propelled a lot of our growth forward. Once we'd won them, we won all of the other presidential campaigns pretty quickly thereafter. And then I would say with that growth, getting to the Series A, and putting sort of that money in the bank allowed us to both double the size of the team and also really give us capital to start investing in sales and marketing in a real way, which, in some ways, the fact that we didn't have a single marketing person on the team for like 2.5 years was a terrible decision. But like, it was really that knowing that we had that Series A capital to like really start to accelerate and build out some of the key functions was really important.
Okay. So if you could go back in time, you'd have a marketing person?
Oh, I do a lot of things differently if I could go back in time. But yes, I would say we should have brought on a marketing person much earlier. We should have professionalized our sales and marketing organization much earlier. I was running all of our sales for quite a while. And then even when I wasn't, I was still heavily involved in it, which is important in the early days, but like there's just a lot that I would have done differently, sort of in retrospect, to make sales a more repeatable playbook. Like if you're building out a sales organization, the thing that you're trying to do as quickly as possible is make it repeatable for a team that can grow. And so there's this great book that I use as a resource, written by this guy, Pete Kazanji, that is sort of a kind of a guru in the tech sales world. And he wrote this book called Founding Sales. And so he talks a lot about like what things should be formalized at different points in sort of like building your sales organization. And we just didn't formalize enough early enough, I think, to make it repeatable. So we didn't have demo scripts for our sales team for like a year and a half, right? Like things like that are just sort of like very basic building blocks that we should have had earlier. I would have done a lot. Same thing with building up marketing much earlier. My co-founder and I wrote all of our customer emails for like the first 2 years, which we shouldn't have been doing, right? Like things like that, where we could have just given ourselves leverage in the organization.
Awesome. Well, good to know. How did your new partnership come about, and what are the pros and cons of the new structure?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit. They approached us, I would say, in when was that? Like the summer of last year, and we knew them very well. So this is another sort of long-term tip as you're thinking about starting companies. Especially if you're in a pretty well-defined space, there will usually be a couple of players that are bigger in that space and have a pattern, hopefully, of being acquisitive, right? Of looking to buy companies and growing inorganically. And so we made sure to build relationships with them from a very early point in the development of the company, not really just because of that, but because we had a lot of shared customers. So we like half of our customers also use their products. And so we built a pretty deep integration between the two platforms. So in a lot of ways, it was a very logical relationship that developed, right? We had this integration, our teams had to work together on certain technical things. There were certain things that came up where, our clients were talking to them about us and, and vice versa, right? Because we had this sort of overlapping client set and we had to solve problems together.
Yeah.
And so it gave us sort of the basis to develop a lot of mutual respect, right? We understood their technology, we understood their product, they understood us in a lot of ways. And so, at one point, as we were really growing quite quickly, it made a lot of sense for them to start to look at, hey, would this make sense to combined as a combined, entity? And for us, what we looked for was sort of four things in sort of thinking about any acquisition. It was, is it values aligned, right? Just purely like we obviously are a company with a very explicit set of values and a social mission, tied to making the world more just, inclusive, and democratic. And so that was sort of the core foundation of anyone that we were going to sell to. If we were going to sell, had to check that box. The second was it had to accelerate our mission. And specifically, we thought about this as like helping us grow faster than we could grow by ourselves in the right way. And so, in this partnership, Every Action is a company that's much bigger than us. They have thousands of clients and organizations that have used their platform. And so we saw an ability to help us grow into their existing client base and as they grew. Third, it had to be a good outcome for team and investors. And four, had to sort of provide the ability for us to keep building some of the things that are critical to our long-term product vision. And so that's really how we thought about it for ourselves, right? Every company, every founding team should think about this differently based on all sorts of things. There are going to be moments, especially as you start to grow, right? There are all these great stories that are ridiculous in some ways, but like, of Mark Zuckerberg getting the $1 billion offer to buy Facebook. And he's like, no, of course, we're not going to take this. Like that, you have to decide, like, that may be the right outcome for you, for that business at that time. And for us, this was the right outcome because it was such a unique sort of alignment across those four factors. They really are in some ways uniquely values aligned, right? They're a platform that works with nonprofits, works with political campaigns, had that really strong customer overlap, and are deeply values aligned, more than literally, I think, any other company, certainly of their scale. Two, they have that overlapping customer base and a huge customer base that we could grow into. It was a good outcome for the team and investors. And again, they really believe in our product vision, so we're continuing to execute on that. So we did talk to some other people at that time when they approached us, but nothing else felt like as much of a fit on those parameters. And we thought about other alternative paths, right? We felt good about continuing to grow independently and then raising a Series B and going and scaling from 40 people to however many and seeing what that looked like. But I think just felt like, given how uniquely aligned those things were, those parameters were, the idea of going and raising more capital to kick the can down the road in some ways about like figuring out what that exit path looked like, it just felt like the right time. I think for us it's mostly upside, right? Like just in terms of like our belief in this partnership. So I wouldn't say that they're necessarily cons in this case, but I do think in general the types of things to think about in any acquisition scenario are like, again, all of those factors, right? Do they align with you? Are they culturally aligned? Do you really respect and believe in them? And do they really respect and believe in you? How much do you care about your product independence, right? Some acquisitions are designed to kill your product and just bring over the team. Some are designed to fully integrate the product, so your product is no longer sort of a separate product. Some are just about distribution and like you get to keep doing your thing and we're going to plug your product into our distribution channels. So you have to be clear with yourself about which things you're open to. But also, I guess it's worth stepping back and saying like acquisitions happen for all sorts of reasons, right? Sometimes it's because you built something valuable, but you can't quite hit escape velocity. And so you're trying to find a soft landing, right? You're trying to find the right home because you couldn't quite fully take off independently. Sometimes it's the opposite. You're doing super well, and someone offers you sort of an outsized offer, a premium to what you think you could go get by raising additional capital, or that you really see that alignment with the company. So there are all different sorts of reasons why acquisitions happen, and so it really does depend on like what the scenario is as to what the pros and cons might be. So there are a bunch that I could talk for hours about sort of thinking through acquisitions and stuff like that, because I think it's a uniquely challenging problem, right? You're trying to put together two companies that have had historically different strategies, different cultures in many cases, different sort of ways of looking at the world. Sometimes we're competitors, and you have to figure out how to put all of those pieces together and make it work. And it turns out like it's challenging, and that's natural. But it's you have to think through a lot of these things pretty carefully as you're going through that process.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm going to have students answer a question. I'm going to ask one more question before I let students start asking questions, because I want to make sure I get yours in there. But you said you started out as a nonprofit organization and then and started focusing more on sales. Does that mean that you became a for-profit organization? And what made you start out as a nonprofit? Was it just that you felt you had to go that route? You didn't. Yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah. So we definitely, it was more from a mission perspective, but then yes, we spun out the technology company as a for-profit at the end of 2017, and so I think that there are a bunch of reasons we did that. Again, part of it was the access to additional financing. Part of it was realizing that we thought the technology side and being able to sell that to clients was the thing that was most differentiated. But I would say, it's sort of a mix of things.
Yeah, awesome. And now I'll let students who has questions.
Hi, I was gonna ask, like, what was the specific moment in your life where you realized that like you wanted to go down this career path, or you wanted to like become who you are?
It's a great question. So I've always I think that there were some traits, personal traits, that made it more likely for me personally. I always had a problem with authority. This doesn't mean that every entrepreneur has a problem with authority, but I certainly was one of them. I didn't necessarily like to follow, other people's instructions. And again, this is not necessarily like good reasons to become entrepreneurs, right? I think a bad reason to become an entrepreneur is because you don't want a boss. Like there are so many downsides to starting a company that like don't do it for that reason. But it was certainly like one of the things that started me down a path of thinking about like my own ideas and stuff like that. I think I always sort of got a rush when I would think through ideas or projects with friends, and not necessarily to start a company, but just like to do a new thing, right? Different adventures. I did this project in sort of early on in college where I was like working with an organization to help them build out a new sort of initiative within the organization. And I like starting something from scratch and getting to define all the pieces. I just found so exciting that I was willing to work a crazy amount to do that. So, I think that there were some sort of like personality defaults, but then I think there were other things where I like started to see that this idea of building something from scratch was really interesting. And then I'm trying to think about how I really decided. I guess on some level, I kind of always assumed I would start something, but I, for a while, I didn't know if it'd be a nonprofit, a for-profit, whatever it was. And then I just got some experience doing it, not just starting a company, but again, sort of taking on, and this is actually something that, just like one data point, right? Me as one data point, I really would recommend is like, figure out if there are ways that you can start something within something else is like actually an interesting starting point. So for example, one of my first jobs was figuring out, the first company that I worked at after college was a company that was based in Mexico and Brazil, and they were trying to figure out if they should expand to Colombia. And so I ended up going to Colombia to like basically do market validation. So I was figuring out if they should like build this new market. And it was a way to like run the entrepreneurial process, right? Where you're like doing market validation, you're testing, but you have an existing product. And so it was like, highly entrepreneurial, but it was a way to figure out that process was something that I really liked, and like have to work with clients directly and have to think through market sizing and have to think through, product market fit and all of those sorts of things. And so I would always recommend like finding ways that you can pressure test whether or not you really like it, because there are a lot of reasons not to start a company, right? Like it can be very stressful. You carry a lot of responsibility. You take on sort of both professional and financial risk. There's, most companies don't succeed, but there are a lot of reasons to do it. And it's like, if you love doing it because you love that process, there's a lot to be said for it. But I would also say that like refining your chops in terms of like learning how that process works and what it looks like, especially when you can get mentorship within an existing organization or company, can be really valuable. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but those are at least a series of random thoughts that I had in response to it.
That was a great response. And we also talked about rule breaking in entrepreneurship earlier this semester, and that being one of the characteristics of many entrepreneurs. How many, other questions?
Was there anyone or anything that inspired you on your journey?
Do you mean before starting or like what after we started?
Before starting.
So in a lot of ways, my co-founder was like a huge both resource and, we played on each other a little bit. We're different but similar in a lot of ways, or we're similar in some ways, but we're very different in others. And so we were like could push each other. And in a lot of ways, that partnership was both a huge reason for our success and growth. And also, I think for me feeling ready to jump into it, right? Like I wouldn't have wanted to do this alone. I might start I wouldn't want to start a company alone. Don't start a company alone. Like it's just a bad idea. I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of company and who you are, but like starting a company, especially if you want to scale it quickly, it's really hard to start it alone. And so I think that like having that really rock solid partnership from the get-go is like critical, and I think fuels a lot of that. Trying to think, I also had friends that had started companies that like I always kind of looked up to. So there were definitely things like that were, just kind of the people along the way that I'd met that had done cool things or things that I thought were cool. Trying to think if there was anyone specifically that like comes to mind. I don't know, I think definitely, I mean, just like generally kind of friends that had started companies always sort of I found to be inspiring or being, sort of interesting to talk to. My first boss, the one that I worked for when I was in Mexico City and Colombia, like he had started this company 7 years prior or something like that. And I think that he was always an inspiration in a lot of ways because he was like my first boss who was a founder. And so I learned a lot from him, like asking him incessantly a lot of questions and things like that. So it was a mix of people, but like generally speaking, people that either, were my co-founder or other people that had started companies before.
And Jeremiah, yeah.
Oh yeah, I want to ask a question. Congrats on everything and all the success. And like initially, like what was your idea for like success for the company? Like what did you like envision for the company, in terms of success? And like as of like right now, have you like hit that mark or like have you like surpassed it or like has it changed? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of entrepreneurs like do have the opposite problem, but I think we actually always underestimated how big it could be. And so when we started, I think we were kind of like, maybe this will be a thing. My co-founder's a little less like this. This may have been more me than him. I think he was always like, oh, this is going to be huge. But me personally, I was like, if we get to build a thing that's cool and used by some people, like that's going to be huge. And like, that's a huge win. And I think we wildly exceeded what we thought we were going to do, just in a lot of ways. We defined success at the beginning of like building something important and impactful. I don't think we actually, again, partly by virtue of the fact that we started at first as a nonprofit, we didn't like mean from the get-go when we quit our jobs, we didn't like mean to start a company that would go on to, grow and scale and, grow, have revenue growth and then get acquired and stuff like that. So like when the thing that inspired us to like quit our jobs was much more the mission. And so from a mission standpoint, we have like way exceeded what I thought we would do, right? The fact that I remember my co-founder and I took this long walk, this like 4-hour walk at some point in 2017 or something like that. We were like, what would it look like to have 1 million people use this thing? And we thought it was like the wildest idea that that we'd ever heard. And like a year later, we'd done it, and it like was hard, but you know, it happened. And then we hit 2, and then we hit 3, and then we hit 4, right? So like in some ways, that like the wildest idea of what it could be that felt impossible, like turns out that it wasn't. And a lot of the way, and in some ways, that's because I think we underestimated how much technology scales, right? Like I think we really didn't understand, like, if you hit a current of like a need, technology scales sort of exponentially, right? Because it doesn't have any marginal cost to like have the next user really. And so I think we underestimated like if you tap into a current, like how big something can be. And so I think that's one big thing. But yeah, from a mission and impact perspective, we like way exceeded what we thought we were going to do. You know, serving the Biden campaign, you know, as one of our biggest clients last year, and running the biggest volunteer program in the country, and having, you know, millions of, you know, I think they had something like 1.6 million volunteers use our platform, just them alone last year, like was, you know, a total dream. And then obviously like going through an acquisition, is I won't pretend like it's not a real milestone that, you know, is important on some level, right? Or important to me at least. I think it is something that is very unique, right? A lot of companies don't get there. In some ways, it's like, it's kind of, it's wild to get to go through that experience. I don't think it's by no means the only definition of success though, right? Like I think that, you know, in some ways for other companies that wanted to grow in a different way or do a different thing, like staying independent would have been the right decision. I think we wanted to grow in a particular way and with a particular partnership that made that make a lot of sense. So I guess I would say that that's a long way of saying the mission and impact was like the number one thing where we way exceeded. And again, we also like accidentally built the business, right? Like that only became clear later on. And then the acquisition sort of in and of itself doesn't have to be the main milestone of success, but like for us was definitely a big deal.
Wow, that's amazing. So Genesis asked a question in the chat. She said, did your mindset change when you were developing your business, and how has it helped you overcome certain challenges?
Yes. So I would say if you're not, so I always joke, like my job changes every 2 to 3 months. Like and if I'm doing the same job 3 months from now, it's probably because I'm doing a bad job. Because it means that like, I'm not building an organization behind me, and we're not growing fast enough. And so I think that two things I would say about that. One, knowing that that's the case took me a long time to learn, right? Like it took me a while to realize that my job should be changing and to get really comfortable with that. And then to proactively like change my job to meet the needs of the company very regularly. But I also think like implicitly at every stage, what is required of you is incredibly different. Right, when we were a 7-person company, I could spend my day like calling random state legislative campaigns that were only going to ever pay us $100 a month, and usually didn't because like, you know, and a number of reasons, because again, you know, your hit rate early on is pretty low. But then, you know, when we were 20 people, I had to spend my time doing something different, right? When we were 40 people, I had to spend my time doing something totally different, right? And I also started, when I started Mobilize, I'd never managed anyone before, right? Like managing people is really hard. So really, really hard. It's like a whole other skill set that like I didn't have when we started this. And so then I went from managing people to managing people who are managing whole teams, right? I have now 10 direct reports that report to me that like the whole company rolls up to. So in some way, shape or form, like, you know, 35 people now like roll up into me, and I have to figure out sort of like how to manage managers. And it's a whole different skill set. Whatever, those are just sort of examples of ways that things change. And in terms of the like how it helped overcome certain challenges, I think it's really easy to both not expect and not be comfortable with your job and role changing really quickly. And I think and then I think the other thing is just like all of the nuances of how you manage people and how you lead teams. And I think that there's also this other inflection point that's like shifting from being a manager to being a leader, and like how do you set the course. So now I spend a lot more of my time like painting the picture for where we're going in the next 2 years than I spend on like day-to-day problems in some ways. Well, that's a little less so right now because we have a lot of like tactical stuff around the integration, but like more and more that became a bigger part of my job. And so how does that help overcome certain challenges? Like it's the kind of, actually one other thing that I'll say, I always joke that my pain threshold has gone up over time because like it can be really painful, but the like what is painful goes up over time, right? Like before we'd like lose a single congressional, like a small client that was going to pay us a couple $100 a month said no, and like I'd be miserable for an hour or something like that. And now it like takes something much bigger to throw me off kilter because we've just like seen that you can go through, like you can get through it, and then you can come out the other side and you can like solve that problem, and then you can do the next thing. And I know it's easy to say that, but I don't actually know if there's any other way to like internalize that other than go through the sort of painful early days of like building a company and having things go wrong, which is sort of unfortunate because it'd be really cool to skip that and like just be really good at not being freaked out by things going wrong. So yeah, I don't know. Those are kind of unstitched together thoughts.
I have another question from Madison. So what was your biggest catalyst for you to start making revenue?
Yeah, so I would say two parts to this question in some ways. One is, why did we decide to start building out a revenue model? And then two, like, how did we start to do it? We decided to build out a revenue model because we wanted to prove that we could go build a scalable business. And so it was important to like prove out that there was a market there that was willing to pay for what we were doing. And so that's really was that turning point. We'd spun out the company. We had raised a little bit of money into the seed round. And then we basically needed to go prove that there was a business to be built because we'd raised sort of very early money and stuff like that. And then I would say, then we started proving that we could, drive sales by, again, sort of that process of like iteratively talking to a bunch of people and, figuring out what they needed, figuring out how much they were willing to pay for it, building the product, and then sort of like iterating over time.
Awesome. So I have a question from Danny. Was there ever a time during your entrepreneurial journey that you would confuse being lazy with being burnt out?
Oh, yeah. Burnout's real. I definitely I will not pretend that there are not dark days when you're starting a company. I guess my problem was never like not being able to do stuff on any given day. It was more like I'd run myself so thin that I was making bad decisions because I was trying to push through, and like I was pissing people off around me because I was being short, because I was staying up until 3 a.m. every day, and then I was being a bad manager, right? Like for me, in my version of that, it looked a lot more like that. Like I was burnt out, but the way it manifested was not like laziness. It was more like being a shitty leader, right? Sorry, excuse my language, but just like it was just like me like having bad days and realizing that like I was not doing a good job. And so I think it was, it took me a long time to learn to balance more, and I still work a lot, but like I preserve a lot more time and I'm much more intentional about where I draw those limits, because burnout's like not just bad and unfun, it's like an existential risk to a business. And I think it took me time to realize that. And it's harder in the early days where you like everything, a lot of things matter, right? Because you're trying to find any little win to propel your growth to the next thing, which is, kind of what we talked about before. So every little thing does feel like a big deal. And in some ways it is a bigger deal. but it's really important to like stay clear-headed, stay arrested, probably not work until 3 a.m. every day, because it's just like can be really damaging.
That was some really, really great comments. I know personally speaking, I'm juggling a lot right now and just seeing like how that all, manifests. So I think we could all use, especially with the pandemic, right? So much going on. So what is the most surprising thing that you've learned since running a business, either about yourself or business in general, or even just entrepreneurship in general?
I don't know what's surprising. I'm trying to think about surprises. I think it's, it's funny, like if you read like, entrepreneurship books or you take an entrepreneurship class, like there are a couple of like sort of lessons that everyone always says, right? Hire a really good team. If you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. Like, there are things that people like sort of say a lot. And I think the thing that sort of surprised me was how true they were, but how no matter how much I read them, I like wasn't going to get it right until I like painfully made the wrong mistake or made the same mistake that everyone had made before me and then like really internalized it. That's also partly that's how I learn, is like I kind of need to experience things to come out the other side. But it did surprise me a little bit how like all of the advice that I'd read in any startup book or anything like that was just like totally right, and how you still kind of have to mess it up before you are going to fully internalize it. So I don't know, that definitely kind of surprised me. I remember having those moments where I was like, oh, I should have known this, but like I guess we probably needed to go through the painful lesson anyways.
How did you meet your co-founder?
It's a very funny story. He is the cousin of my first boss. So very much sort of like a social connection. We became friends, like casual friends, casual acquaintances. And then I was starting to think about some ideas. He was starting to think about some ideas, and we sort of sat down and realized that there was maybe some degree of overlap there.
Okay, because I think sometimes when you say co-founder, people may think, oh, should I just ask my friend to start a business with me?
So it's funny, my best friend and I have joked many times about whether or not we should start a company together. I think we've generally netted out in the place that like it's probably a bad idea. And I run, it's interestingly, my co-founder became one of my best friends, but like it's a different relationship, right? Like it's in some ways it's a real partnership. You're building something that it requires some of the deepest levels of trust. We always joke like he and I spent a lot more time than he did with his wife, right? Like, just because by virtue of like our work days being really long and really intense, like there's a lot that we went through. But I would be reticent to start a company with just like a pure friend that like you knew not from work context.
Yeah, I agree. Completely agree with that. Jeremiah, do you have a question?
Oh yeah. I had a question about like the co-founder stuff. Did you guys ever like clash heads at times, and like what did you do to like I guess come to a conclusion or agreement?
I would say so. Yes, we did. We've both talked about like writing a sort of here's how to handle co-founder clashes. And I would say we've both given advice to other entrepreneurs since starting and since working through it. Like the early days were tough for us. Like we butted heads a lot. And I think that there was sort of a couple of things that I would do in retrospect that I've advised, friends that are starting companies to do, which is to really like kind of have like almost an upfront marriage contract, right? It's sort of a like, hey, here is what first of all, you have to talk through roles. You have to talk really deeply about like what motivates you and like the worst things about you. Like you have to tell that person the worst things about you because they're going to need to deal with it when it gets bad. Like what drives your ego? What things you need to feel good about yourself, which sometimes is like, praise, and sometimes is like needing to feel important or whatever that is. Like you need to be like sort of gloves off with that stuff. And so really defining that sort of stuff up front. What are your expectations of each other? And what are you going to do if you're not meeting them? Right? Like what if someone is in a job, is fulfilling a role that they're not doing a good job in? How are you going to handle that? You need to define that up front as much as possible, or at least talk through it to build the muscle of learning how to address those sorts of things. thinking through equity splits, I think is really important. There are a lot of sort of, good articles and stuff like that on like how to do that right. And I would just, there are a couple of other books on like partnership contract, sort of like how you actually have those conversations, that I would recommend. And I just think in general, like having as much gloves off conversation up front as possible is like super important.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone say to outline the worst things about you, but I think that is one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard. And I think it actually extends far beyond business, even marriage, friendships.
Totally. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is like the other thing that has maybe surprised me about starting a company is like how much of it ends up playing out in like, your personal life as well, right? Like what you learn in like a business context is really just like being a leader or whatever. Like as you get better as a leader, like you just get better at like talking to people, because most things in life are just like expectation setting. And so if you like can set expectations in a company, you can set expectations in your friendships or your personal life or whatever that is. And vice versa, right? I think that those things actually overlap more than we give them credit for, because a lot of like starting a company is just like rallying people around your idea. And so like there is sort of an aspect of that that's very real.
What is the future of Mobilize? What does that look like?
We're growing a bunch. We're adding new clients to the network. We're growing the network. We're turning Mobilize much more into sort of a real consumer brand. It's grown a lot as a consumer brand, but that's sort of a big thing. Obviously, continuing the integration with every action, and really sort of turning that. It takes a while to really like build out all of the pieces of that partnership, and all of the operational things, right? We had to like move our billing, we had to move IT systems, right? Like all different sorts of things. And sort of like get through that. But really just continuing to grow, add a lot more clients to our platform and build out that network, and keep innovating on the product side. So lots of fun things. The way we talk about Mobilize is like we're on the path to being the destination for all high impact action. So if you're someone that wants to do something to have an impact in your community, like we will be the place that you can go to find any action near you to take that. And sort of the way we get there is by adding, thousands of more organizations to our platform and continuing to build up the network, in pretty fast order. So, there's a lot of growth ahead of us.
Awesome. And thank you so much for speaking with us today. Thank you, Stacy, for introducing him to me in this class. And this was phenomenal. And you'll have the recording by next week. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Thanks for being here, Alan. It was great.
Talk to you all soon.
And wait, just before you sign off, can I just ask, so does it make sense for the students here to like sign up on Mobilize and like create a profile, or is it the kind of thing where they just look to see events that they might be interested in?
Yeah, if you go to mobilize.us, you can go and find events that are near you, and see if there's anything that's interesting, and then you'll sort of get updates regularly if you do that on the different events that you can sign up for.
Okay.
Awesome.
Love it.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you for joining.
Talk to you all soon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.